All right, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here today. I'll start to share my screen with you in the PowerPoint presentation I have in a second, but just to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from with this and what I base this presentation on. I began working as a journalist right out of college in Erie, Pennsylvania for two different television stations there, the ABC and CBS affiliates. I started out as a weekend reporter and cameraman during the week, and progressed to weekend reporter, switched stations, became a producer, was the executive producer at 11 o'clock news. I also did some anchoring along the way there. And then along the way, I decided to change careers, and I went into public relations and healthcare for about 5 years, and then went to graduate school to earn my master's in journalism and PhD in mass communication with journalism as a focus at Ohio University. I also worked along the way for about a dozen national magazines as a freelancer, publishing about 100 or so articles that way, and then ran my own public relations business for a while before I went back into academia and started to make use of that expensive PhD that I earned. I come at this as someone who's worked, has been a non-media person as well as someone who's been an academic on it. So I hope that will help you along the way. And one other thing I want to mention here too is that I'm not a political person. I am just absolutely infuriated with Republicans and Democrats and libertarians and third parties equally, although I dislike some more than others. So a lot of my comments come from just my disgust with the political system in general. And take that in mind in terms of how you view my presentation here tonight. And we'll talk a little bit about that, actually quite a bit about how our own ideology and belief systems influences our decisions to separate the news from the chaff. So with that being said, let me take and share this screen with you here. I assume you can now see the slide that says sorting the news from the chaff. Everyone, can I get like a thumbs up? Okay, cool. All right, we're off. So this is normally something done through the Vermont Humanities Council, and because you guys didn't have quite enough time to go through that way, I'm still pitching out to them that this is a regular part of their talks and what they use a lot of their monies for to help support speakers like myself come to organizations like yours to certainly defray the cost substantially along the way. Okay, so I don't know about you guys, but I'm tired of sorting the news from the non-news or the fake news or whatever we want to call it here. And I'm not at all alone in this process here. There is absolutely little trust in the news media, particularly television, but also newspapers, magazines, online. It's a terrible situation. And if we look at some of the most recent polling on consumer confidence here, you'll see that only about 40% of Americans have a great deal or even a fair amount of confidence in news, yet a third have zero confidence at all in the news. And that's a bad situation for a democracy that depends upon being informed to make good decisions about every issue, not to mention vote for candidates who will help fulfill the American dream. We're facing a really tough moment in sorting the news from the chaff when people don't trust, or to some extent to even have a great deal or a fair amount of trust, because I think both sides are deadly wrong at this point, especially when it comes to television news, although I'll get into a little more detail on that later. But it is a bad time in particular when we look at how much more effective fake news is besides in comparison to real news. So for example, it talks about here about false stories going further and faster than true ones by several measures. They're 70% more likely to be retweeted. Fake news, 70% more likely to be retweeted. And they talk about reaching a cascade depth of 10, about 20 times faster. What they mean by cascade depth is somebody actually retweeting it or passing along in Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So it gets to 10 passes alongs 20 times faster than real accurate news does. That makes it really hard to combat fake news, and it makes it really hard for members of the public to take and figure out what is true when the fake news is outdistancing it tenfold over. And look at this again. True stories never get past being passed along 10 times, where false stories will go be passed along 19 times. So, as it says here, fake news gets out 6 times faster than does the others when it's set to reach 1,500 viewers along the way. We're in bad shape there. And as you know, the members of tech industries were in front of Congress the other days talking, and I don't know exactly, I did not get to see those news stories about that, but Facebook and other social media sites aren't really helping the situation here at all when it comes to fake news. In particular, Facebook in just about a year or so ago said, look, we're going to get rid of these algorithms that are feeding people more fake news than real news. And instead they said, we're going to rate news based upon what the public tells us is good news. And while that sounds like a great idea at first, oh yeah, let's find out what the people find informative. Let's find out what the news is that people find to be relevant to them. What they're actually finding is, when you look at that last slide about fake news advancing, is that the monkeys are running the circus on Facebook. The very people who are making bad decisions about news are the ones setting Facebook's modern algorithms to keep passing along the worst news as we move. So it's a kind of a dire situation. How do you solve this situation? Well, I got to tell you, the answer is easy, but it's really hard to get there. Really hard. And it's going to mean a lot of work for all of us, which is really sad because the biggest promise that the internet had for us was to make information easier to get and to make us better informed, because we would have so much more information available that would be able to come to better decisions. Its other big promise was that it allowed anyone to be a publisher. Fred, is it Brunig there? Fred, could you own a TV station easily? No, you couldn't. Warren, could you own a radio station easily? Carl Peterson, could you own a magazine or a newspaper? You couldn't. The internet was your chance to have your own newspaper, to have your own television station, your own radio station, your own internet portal to the world. And unfortunately, we've used it to take and flood the world with useless information, predominantly, or at least information that isn't as accurate as it should be. And that's shame. So it now means we've got to do at least 3 things to do a better job, or let's say to do 3 things to take and better sort through all of the cat videos on the internet, to get past the absolute ideological bent of Fox News or the ratings whoring of CNN News. And it's not easy to do because it's time consuming and challenging. So the first part of my presentation here is to talk about these 3 things we need to do to begin to sort this fake news from the real news. Our first part with overcoming ourselves deals with psychology of perception and how our perception shapes our belief systems. And if you'd ever had a survey level course of psychology in high school or college, you may have heard about some of these terms before. Let me just give a brief description in case it's been a while since you've done something like this, or just to refresh your mind here. Cognitive dissonance, what this is the pain that occurs when you're trying to simultaneously hold 2 or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. For example, anyone who smokes cigarettes today certainly has to know from a medical standpoint that the information is pretty solid that this is not good for you. But at the same time, they continue to smoke. That's a form of dissonance, a form of noise in your beliefs. How do I contradict the fact that I want to do something that is bad for me here? And it's the same thing that sorts of happens here with people with news themselves, that how do I separate my ideology, say, for example, about Joe Biden or President Trump, when I already have a view about Trump that is contradictory to what I'm seeing in the media? So our first problem is to recognize that cognitive dissonance exists and that it's going to happen all the time. And if we don't recognize the fact that the information we're hearing is conflicting with our own beliefs, we're probably going to miss out on accurate information that could help us. Sometimes that cognitive dissonance is good. It helps us spot bad news, but it's just as possible for this contradiction to make us reject accurate information. One of the things that we see that causes confirmation, or that prevents, that our brain does to prevent cognitive dissonance, is something called confirmation bias. We don't like to have this war in our heads about dueling beliefs. So what do? We try to only perceive things in such a way that it helps us avoid the dissonance here. And I love this because I see this all the time with my students when they do research projects. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I've been at Keene State College here in Keene, New Hampshire, the southwest corner of the state, for about 20 years now. And I teach classes in journalism and mass communication. And when I assign papers all the time, the student, instead of gathering information and then weighing the information and making a decision, they tend to say, here's what I believe. Now let's go find some information that supports my belief system. That's not good critical thinking. That's not good intellectual use of the mind. Yet that's exactly how our brains are sorted out to sort of work like this. And unfortunately, this first link that agrees with what you already believe has a tendency to lead us in the same direction we've always been going, rather than to get us to believe something new that could be more truthful. It's the same thing too with selective exposure, avoiding information or sources which contradict our pre-existing views. I just love this slide here with everybody's lined up for comforting lies. Nobody wants to go to hear unpleasant truths. So when we start to look at these first two things here, it's recognizing that you cannot stop at the very first thing that comes along that confirms what you believe. As a matter of fact, you need to be looking at things that actually are directly opposed to what you believe. Only then can you begin to weigh out the real news from the chaff. And it's the same thing here with selective exposure. If you're a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, well, you need to watch MSNBC sometimes, or watch CNN. And if you're a progressive or more liberal or however, you need to go tune into Fox News sometimes too. And you need to look at conservative publications. There's a lot there that may inform you in a way that you're not getting informed from your own reliable news source along the way. I'll pause for just one section here just to see if anyone might have a comment, or a question more so than a comment. Is there anyone who wants to jump in at this point? Or ask a question even?
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Evie Marcolini, and my husband and I are both new residents in Thetford. So thank you to the Historical Society for putting this on. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear you, and thank you for giving this talk. I appreciate your expertise. My question is, taking into consideration the technology that we have now with iPhones and computers and laptops and tweeting and Facebook and all that, is there any other time in history when we've had a similar experience where the news has not been true, even though we didn't have all of these technologies to access it so easily? Has there ever been another time when this kind of thing has happened, and what did it do to our democracy and our society, and did we get past it?
Evie, awesome question. And it's one I've often thought about introducing in that earlier part when I talked about how bad the problem is. And I don't, because it almost misdirects the conversation, but it's a perfect moment for it now. So thank you for asking that. And thank you, by the way, to the Historical Society and all of you for letting me be here tonight. It's a privilege. Evie, the sad part is that what we're experiencing now is the norm throughout history. There have been fewer decades in American life where the news was trusted than it wasn't trusted. About the only period, and judging from the pictures here that I see of the people, there's a few people younger here than me, but most I just turned 60s. Most of us are that age, or a little, around that age here. You lived through the golden era of news from about 1950 through 1975, 1980 or so. Remember, how many of you remember Walter Cronkite? Quick wave, hand. Uncle Walt, most trusted man in America year after year. If Walter Cronkite said it, you damn well knew it was true. And that was about the only period in American history where we had that kind of belief in news coverage. From the very start, right after the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was out, just getting right into the early 1800s and actually the late 1700s, we had this incredible partisanship among the media of the day with newspapers. And the newspapers were defined almost entirely by which party they supported in the elections. And it led to terrible situations, among them the Alien and Sedition laws there at the late 1700s, where it became illegal to criticize a government official. And there were editors of papers and reporters and people jailed, fully against First Amendment rights because they dared criticize someone. And the reason that kind of activity started to happen was because the incredible partisanship of the press of that period. Jumping up 100 years, we started to see this with yellow journalism and Hearst and William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer, the newspaper magnates of the time period. Hearst is famously noted, and we're not sure if he actually said it, talking about the Spanish-American War. He sent a reporter down there to cover the war, and the reporter's like, nothing's going on. And he says, no, you just supply the copy, I'll supply the war. You had huge amounts of misinformation solely by people like Hearst and also Pulitzer to raise money. And as a result, we went to a war, which we may or may not have needed. It wasn't much better through the 20s or 30s or the 40s. It's only once television started coming in to where journalism reached this golden age. And I hate to say we've faded out of it. Unfortunately, it has gotten worse in some ways, but still, we probably see individually more better stories today than we ever have before. Now, that's probably a longer answer than you wanted for that, but I hope that helped a little bit. Let me jump back up to our next piece here. So if we start to realize that we're our own worst enemies in sorting through information that makes us unhappy, we also have to realize that news and news organizations, they have agendas too. They have ideologies too. And the best news organizations try to push their own ideology out of the way. And it's impossible to do. Absolute objectivity is impossible. But we can come reasonably close. But the first thing we have to check is, what is the agenda of the news organizations we listen to, or of at least the content creators that we get information from? Where does that meme come from that came across on Facebook or Instagram? When I listen on the radio to the newscast there, well, you know, what is that station about? What's its news organization like? And then, despite thinking through all of that, and we'll talk about how to think about that in a moment, we still have to realize that news is always a business. It has to make its own money to stay in operation. And unfortunately, there are individuals who are more than willing to prostitute themselves to make money in the guise of news. And unfortunately, there are people in legitimate news organizations that are trying very hard not to be ideological, to be as truthful as actually, that they still get led astray by the sheer fact that they have to make money. I would argue that, you know, between CNN and Fox, we see these two things created here perfectly. Fox has absolutely sold its soul almost 100%, 90% anyways, to take and cater to a specific audience by giving them information that is less concerned with accuracy than it is with supporting an ideological belief system. On the other hand, CNN has absolutely prostituted itself for the sake of ratings. And along the way, there are certainly individuals, I believe, within CNN who are also ideologically driven against conservatism, and President Trump in particular along the way, that in such a way that it makes them money, and they're more than happy to go along with that. Let me take and go in through a little bit more with that and explain that with a little bit more. So when we begin to measure news, when you get a news story, find out who it's from there and tell me, what do you think their agenda is here? Is it really a model to provide an accurate, comprehensive, unbiased account of events? Do they really want to educate you about this? Do they really want to hold a mirror up for us to look at so we can see who we are? Now, this very first part that I'm teaching here about providing an accurate account, education, mirroring society, these are the very things that journalism students are taught virtually at every journalism program across the country. But it's not easy to do those things or to live up to that high set of values that we do here. And then we run across organizations that also have an agenda. And a lot of the fake news that we're seeing out in there, particularly that coming via social media and the internet, is from news organizations or fake news organizations, or certainly individuals whose agenda is not to take and assist society, but instead to benefit the content creators by either making it money or forcing a particular ideological agenda upon the public. One of the things that can happen here, and that should help you when you begin to think about measuring the news source you're with here, is to use this critical thinking model. And I cannot tell you how much I love this model. And if you go to criticalthinking.org or Google elements of thought and critical thinking, this will come up, and it's an interactive chart. And in particular, the first couple of things that you're going to want to look at here when you're judging a news organization is to see what is its frame of reference, its perspective, its orientation. Does this news organization try to be as fair as possible, or is it purposefully presenting just a particular viewpoint? If we take the agenda of The Nation or The New Republic, liberal and conservative news magazines, well, for anyone who knows anything about them, it's pretty clear that both of these media outlets have a particular point of view, one conservative, one progressive. So it's not so hard to read them and understand that they're coming from a viewpoint, and to recognize that's one perspective. I need to look at another. But other organizations, it's not so easy to figure that out along the way. And if you can't figure out their point of view, their frame of reference, the perspective from which they come on, then how is it that you can find out their purpose or goal? It's a challenge. And one of the things that I try to teach my students to do, or other people, is that when you get a piece of news, go find out who it's from. Read their website. Find out what their stated purposes, goals, and objectives are. Look at the people on their board of directors or their writers. Where do they come from? Were they educated in traditional journalism, or are they political science people? Or you know, what is their background that leads them to come up with the types of stories they do and the information that they present as true? I'm going to touch on this chart and how to think about it a little bit later, but that's one of our first steps here of thinking about, you know, is this point of view one of serving democracy or of making money? Is this purpose one of making us better informed, or of enforcing a particular ideology because that's what the owner of the network or the newspaper wants to do? Now, it's sad that money is a part of this, but money for news organizations is freedom from control. If you do not get money from advertisers, there's only a couple other places you can go to, either your viewers or to the government. Here in the United States, we have public television and public radio. They've been able to go to the viewers to get the money. And I think, what do they get? Just a few percent of their budget from the national government, which they could do without if they had to. So one of the things that I think makes national public radio news good is that it is free from advertising control, and certainly almost no government control whatsoever. But that's not to say that government control can't work. BBC traditionally in the past has been highly subsidized by the British government, yet it's considered one of the best news sources in the world, especially for international news. So they've been able to escape some of that corruption. But remember, the government in England, when it collects money for the BBC, it taxes everyone for every TV and radio that you have. So one way or another, they pay for that service. Here, we pay for media by tolerating advertisers or sponsors, having a delay in the news so that we can watch a commercial. But certainly news organizations can be corrupted by this process. And I would argue that both Fox and CNN television news are terribly corrupted by the monetary aspect. I'm going to just do this next part here, and then I'll open up for questions, because I can already see a couple people starting to think, but what about that? So hold on to your hat for a minute, and I'll get to you here. So once we figure out our own problems with perception of news, and we start to understand that the news media has its own agendas and that it's always going to be a business, this helps us to start to use that chart that I was talking about here. Well, what are the intellectual standards we want to measure from a news source? Well, what's its accuracy? And the only way you can really judge accuracy is record over time. Even a blind squirrel finds an acorn. Well, even the worst news organizations sometimes do really accurate, really good stories. But I'm less likely to believe that news piece from that, because I know that over a period of time, they're not going to be the most accurate. Also, looking at comprehensiveness. You know, the problem with watching Fox News or the problem with watching CNN is that you have 3 or 4 people on one side of the ideology against one person on the other side. And that one person on the other side doesn't usually traditionally represent their side all that well. It's the token liberal or the token conservative on these shows. We need to look for programs, news, and news stories that don't just give one side of the issue. They take and cover other perceptions, other assessments, other ideologies, other perspectives as we move along. And while we're talking about fairness, you know, did they allow the progressive to speak on Fox? But did they actually take him or her at their word and not just cut them off all the time? Did they go to other progressives, not just the one person? And sometimes, you know, it doesn't have to be equal. For every 2 conservatives, you have 2 progressives, but at least reasonable people here who are representative of other ideologies here. And then we gotta have to start to look at that particular information. You know, is it logical? Is it analysis versus speculation? Is it a recognition that often they make, the people on there talking are making assumptions about things? And that's one of the things that really just disgusts me as a former broadcast journalist with Fox and CNN, is that it seems to me to be way more speculation than analysis. And I separate those differences. And then analysis is based upon proven fact, or at least the best information that can be had at a time. Speculation is just guessing what might be out there. It's making nothing but assumptions about what might happen and what other people's goals and purposes are. And until we can begin to sort out that information with the news and measure its logic, go through that wheel, which we're going to get back to here in a minute, we're in a really sad place. I'm going to pause at this spot here and take and open this back up again to see if I might get a question. And I promise to take more than one this time if anyone would like to come out.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please go ahead.
I was curious what your perspective is on organizations that rate various news sources on a variety of spectra. I'm thinking of something like Media Bias Fact Check, and I think there are some others as well.
Oh, you're prescient. We're going to look at that in just a minute here. That, yeah, that's an interesting thing. And to be honest, I'm a little torn on it, but I'll let you guys kind of talk about it first before I go into it. But we're going to go look at that media bias chart from them.
Okay, thanks.
Another question. All right, I will move on and try to get more provocative here. So one of the ways to guard yourself against fake news after we've looked at the regular news that we recognize is real news, CNN has real news, Fox has real news. And actually, if you get away from their commentary and, you know, the main parts of the show, just to here's the news at the top of the hour, they're no worse or no better than CNN along the way. It's when we get away from the here's, you know, the top 5 minutes of news stories from the day. But what do we do when we don't have a CNN or a New York Times or I'm not familiar with your town. Do you guys have a local newspaper? No. Okay.
Yeah, we have the Valley News.
Oh, okay. All right. I should have known that for now. The Valley News. That's a source, you know, and it has a record. But what about for something that you never gotten before? Well, right away, I would say that the first step in sorting getting the chaff out of it here is, look, if you've never heard of this news source, or if you got it over the internet from your cousin Fred, you need to start questioning the validity of that. I'm not saying it can't be true. I'm just saying it's less likely to be untrue coming that way than through hopping onto the Associated Press website or BDC or listening to NPR or something in the morning. One of the other things too is look through that story and see, geez, do they have sources? Are they citing anyone? You know, according to a study from, let's say, the Centers for Disease Control, for example, if we're talking about the pandemic, if they're not telling you where this COVID-19 info is coming from, then I got to question that, because one of the things we teach journalists is to attribute information to reliable sources. And most of the chaff that we get doesn't have attribution at all. It's just these wild statements, some of which may be true, but certainly statements that we should be skeptical about. And when I find something that, okay, I've never heard of this source before, they don't have any attribution to other sources, I'm going to go see if I can find this same information from a news source I do trust. Now, this is what I was talking about before. Already, I'm having you do a psychoanalysis on yourself. You need to sit down for a half hour and pretend you're Freud and interview yourself. Then I'm asking you to sit down and do a business analysis of the news source you're with and research on their background and the people involved with them and how they view doing news. That's a lot of time for even one news source, not to mention the several that many of us listen to or read on a regular day. And now I'm saying, geez, every time you get a story, you should go look and see if you can back it out from another news source. I mean, how many hours in a day do you have to dissect a 5-minute newscast or even one news story in your local paper? It's time. And unfortunately, the internet was supposed to save us that time, to make it easier. And if anything, it's made it tenfold worse, because most people are not educated or media literate enough take and recognize the things that I'm talking about here tonight. There are a couple things, however, that can make life a little bit easier, especially if you're getting news through social media. And that's this last part here. Look, when you get something that identifies itself as news or it seems like news, check for errors in spelling, grammar, punctuation, awkward use of the English language. We know right now, and I meant to put this slide in, but I'll have to do it at a later date, that the majority of the fake news that we get about elections comes from overseas, from people intentionally there, and some are government sponsored, some are not, but they're purposely putting out information to mislead Americans here. And they make mistakes, a lot of mistakes, and we should recognize them. For example, the New York Times did a very fascinating piece, and I've got a link here so you can go see some of the other ones here, where they pulled some of the most popular memes that were heading out in social media here that were designed specifically to scare conservatives and to bolster conservative voting towards particular candidates. In this case, frightening people into thinking that there was going to be race war, that there was going to be a race war in America, and that people were already working towards that. Yet, if we look at this situation here, notice the part through the top. Join Black Elevation Team, comma, we're hiring. That's bad grammar. It's a comma spice. These are two separate sentences. Join Black Elevation Team, period. We're hiring. Okay. Position, event coordinator part-time. That's okay. Look at the next part though. Salary is paid in two equal parts. Questionable about the use of the colon there. One before the end, comma, and one after. You don't need that comma there. Now, I'm not an expert in grammar, and I don't imagine a lot of you folks really enjoy going through and dissecting grammar and finding dangling participles and gerund phrases. And I can't even recall what either of those things are. We have an English teacher in there who could fill me in later on what a gerund phrase is or a dangling participle. I don't recall. But one of the things here you can see quite often, and the New York Times had several of these, and they're really quite hilarious. And the fact that there are some individuals who saw this and are thinking, oh my God, race war is around the corner, I better arm up, we're going to be fighting. And you can imagine this kind of thing coming out during this period of Black Lives Matter, of the kind of legitimacy that fear about existing current events could cause people to believe a particular way. Maybe it would be a good time to take and stop again to see if there's another question here, if anyone has something for me. Paul, Susan? Your mic is muted, Susan, if you could unmute. There you go.
Dr. Timney, do you have any experience with Newsbreak?
Newsbreak, I do not.
Very, very interesting recent phenomenon online. It can come in ahead of the Valley News, ahead of so many of our local sources, with headlines that blow me away. They seem to be based in Malaysia. I don't know who's funding them, but they are crackerjack at getting the headlines. They also have a lot of garbage language, just really poorly proofread, lousy style. I can't tell you how many boo-boos I found.
All right.
Very easy
I'll check it out. And one of the things that I would say for you, for your own research, is go find out who's funding them. What's their business model? Who are they, part of a corporation? Are they own little group? Are their journalists trained? Those are great questions from them. But even, it's like, I forget what stories. Have you heard of the Drudge Report here in the United States? Matt Drudge. It's a very popular online conservative thing. They've broken a lot of news stories, but that doesn't mean I'm going to trust them. But they were the first to put this out to the public.
Yeah.
Other questions? Okay, I'll jump you back to the share. So really, when you're beginning to evaluate news, or really what's cool about this chart, and I think this is the most important thing I've ever taught anyone in my life. So again, just Google elements of thought, critical thinking, and you'll get this interactive chart that'll show up here. Just real quickly, it's like anytime we think or evaluate or have a question, whether we know it or not, we're doing all 8 of these things. And the problem is that we often don't know we're doing these things. We often skip over them or we shortcut them along the way. So if I have a question, any question, who should I vote for? And when I see a news story about a candidate, Trump or Biden, you know, how is that relating to the news I get about this question of voting? Well, what's your own point of view? That's a pretty easy one. But when I see that story, you know, we've already talked about what's the perspective of the news site that's giving me this information about one of the candidates? What's their purpose? But then we have to look about, well, what information did they give me? Well, we can very easily see that they're giving us data and what they call facts or observations. But is this really logical information that they're giving? Is it fair? Is it clearly presented? Is it accurate? Is it precise? How much depth is it really gone into? And when we talk about breadth, that includes, well, how many different perspectives did we look at? For example, if you're asking the question, which candidate has a better economic plan for America after the pandemic is over? Well, how much depth did it really go into to explain either politician's plan? Did they ask more than just the political people when we're talking about breadth, about this measurement of how good their economic plan is? Or did they actually go look at another perspective, more breadth, like the perspective of an economist or maybe of a political scientist? If we're talking about something like an issue, a question about gun control, well, we can get a lot of data here for this, but you know, I'm not going to believe anything that the NRA puts out, nor am I going to believe much of what Anytown, which is the group in Connecticut that went through the mass shooting there, Anytown for Gun Safety, I think is their name. You know, right away, I know that's coming from organizations that have a particular purpose, one, to get rid of guns, period, one, to make guns legal almost all the time with minimal regulation. Knowing that about them is important. Do I fully understand the concepts that are in here? When we're talking about economic for this, do you understand supply side, demand side? Do we know the economic models that exist, how things have worked in the past with government programs in terms of expenditure and return? If you're not familiar with all these concepts, and if the news organization isn't explaining them or using past models or examples of economic revitalization, then that's probably not good news. Are we considering the implications and consequences? If I pick candidate A and this plan works or doesn't work, what happens next compared to if I pick candidate B along these ways? Do I know what assumptions, things I'm presupposing to take as true, even though I don't have evidence to support them as being true along the way? This model and then these intellectual standards along the side to hold each of them true. You know, when I make an assumption, some assumptions are logical, some are not. When I look at information, some's significant, some is relevant, some isn't, some's not significant. How do I go through this? Do I have enough precision when I'm talking about a concept here that, you know, if we're talking about, well, should I wear a coat today because, you know, for the weather? Well, how precise do I need to be? I usually need to know temperature, precipitation, wind. After that, that's enough precision. But if I'm making long range forecasts, I probably have to know more precision, like dew point, like what's some of the other barometric pressure. That would be the type of precision we would need for here. So this model in questioning presentations is incredibly valuable. Do I have any questions on this wheel or how to think about evaluating good news from bad news in its use?
Mark, I have another question.
Please go ahead, Evie.
Okay. you're telling us that we need to read the news of the point of view that we might not agree with.
Yes.
And you're also saying if you pick up a certain piece of media and you know where it comes from, you're not going to believe it at all. So that's a little bit puzzling to me, because I don't really want to listen to the other side because I don't trust
Right.
them. So can you bring that together for me?
Yeah, Evie, and I know what you're saying here because I kind of made a statement and I didn't catch myself till about 5 seconds after I said it. If I get something from the NRA about gun control, it's not that I'm not even going to look at it or not believe it at all. There's certainly going to be some information in it that's probably reasonably accurate. Some. It's the same thing with Everytown for gun safety for that. I'm not going to automatically throw out everything they say. I'm going to read their material, but I'm going to be skeptical about them, just as I am skeptical about the NRA. So I hope that helps clarify that for you a little bit here. But I am asking you to approach media that you don't trust with a skeptical eye. But I'm also asking you to approach media that you do trust with an equally skeptical eye.
Okay.
Does that help a little bit?
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. I apologize because I get why you said that, because I made a really bad statement there and I wasn't able to get back to it. Anyone else at this point? Okay. Let me share again and we'll go back. And here's the chart that we had. Who was it who asked about this? One of the things that can help you get started in being a news skeptic and being a news researcher, a truth finder, is to take and use some existing groups that have tried to map out where media stands. And there are some people who've put out this news bias chart. And in a second here, we'll start to fill this out. And I want you to think about the news organizations that you know, maybe ones that you go to frequently or ones that you occasionally go to or ones that you absolutely hate, and try to figure out where they fall. So how this chart breaks out is on the left side, you'll find news organizations that tend to skew more liberal. On the right side, you find news organizations that skew more conservative. Then if we look at this from a vertical standpoint, you'll see news information at the bottom, which is purely just clickbait or sensationalistic driven. Then we get our basic news. Then in the middle, we start to find news that at least meets high standards. Okay. And then we're moving up to analytical and more complex news that gets into detail in a good way. So what we're hoping here is to find our favorite news organizations falling into this middle ground here. But that's not to say that we can't come over to news organizations that are hyper-partisan, because we can still find complex analytical pieces here that acknowledge other viewpoints. And we can find that on both sides. And we can often find great in-depth news here. It's coming from a slight skew towards conservative or liberal. It's useful, it's reputable, but it's not presenting as many viewpoints. And then certainly we can go out to the extreme edge where we find absolute garbage that is purely ideologically or monetarily driven sorts of news. Okay, so we want to stay away from stuff that's below this, and hopefully things that fall into this middle ground here that I'm circling with my mouse cursor. With that in mind here, place your bets. Where are you putting your news organizations that you follow and listen to? Here we go, spin the wheel. I'm going to give you some close-ups of each of these parts so that you can see them, because I don't think they're going to be super easy for you to view at this point. Am I correct in that? Does somebody want to take and tell me? Steve, how easily can you read this chart? Oops, your mic's still off, Steve.
It's a little difficult to see, but
All right.
I can see if I get close to the screen.
I'll zoom it up and we'll go back and forth in between this. So let me go first to the bottom of the chart. You're seeing this part down here circled in red. That's where we're heading. Hopefully this will help a little bit. So remember, in the middle is preventing bias. It's good to see that the National Enquirer is there. I don't want any partisanship when I'm reading about dingoes eating the baby in Australia or about the aliens who landed in New Jersey. Okay, keep Republicans and Democrats out of that. On the other hand, is it any surprise that we would find Breitbart, InfoWars, The Blaze, The Daily Caller, Fox News, Daily Wire, over in the absolutely unfair interpretations, absolute nonsense and damaging to public discourse? And if we go to the liberal side, we'll start to see the same sort of things here. And this has often been a shock to some progressives and groups. Occupy Democrats is right here. Palmer Report, Patriotbiotics, Natural News. To be honest, I haven't heard about most of these. I have heard of a few of the conservative ones. But right away, when we look at these things, I mean, they're not just skewing towards one side. They're basically here to get money, or in the case of InfoWars, to make money, and also to advance an extreme conservative agenda. Do I have any questions on this before I move on with this?
No.
Okay. By the way, you can see the New Republic up here, which is selective, but it tries to be fair, but it's from one particular viewpoint. Same thing with BuzzFeed. We'll get over here later and you'll actually see the Nation, which is the conservative version of that. Let me take you to the next one. So now here we are in the upper left-hand corner of this, up in this part. We're still on the partisan, from opinion and fair up to original fact reporting. And I think you're definitely going to recognize a few of these organizations. Not surprisingly, MSNBC skews liberal, and some of it skews over into hyper-partisan liberal. Here we see The Nation, okay, Democracy Now!, Slate, Daily Beast. Okay. Now, again, I'm showing you this chart because sometimes it can help us shortcut the homework we have to do, or at the very least, recognize that when I read something from The Nation, or The Atlantic, by the way, which is in part of this too, and I would agree, I love The Atlantic's articles, but I recognize that they come from a liberal viewpoint all the time, and sometimes a hyper-partisan liberal viewpoint. Mother Jones certainly has done some wonderful stuff, but it's also done some incredibly bad reporting, especially about firearms in particular, that is purely matched to take and meet a liberal ideology here. Any questions on this part of the screen before I move on? Okay, now we're going to the conservative side, where we've still got some decent level of information along the way, but we're starting to see, again, things skewing. Here's the National Review, the conservative version of that, where it goes from everything to being, okay, certainly partisan to hyper-partisan, but it's a decent quality of news. And as long as you recognize that this comes from a conservative perspective, and generally only a conservative perspective, that's not such a bad thing, as long as we recognize it. Now we're getting up into where most of us are at for news. And I'll be curious to see, as the person asked earlier, how accurate do you think this is? Do you think the New York Times deserves to be in this place here where it is minimal partisan bias as still as skewing liberal? That seems reasonably accurate to me. I don't know what you guys think. Or that the Wall Street Journal, a contemporary, is on the perfect opposite side of that, as is the Christian Science Monitor. Fascinating that PBS kind of falls on the minimal partisan on the conservative side, but NPR falls on minimal partisan on the liberal side. ABC News versus CBS News. NBC, not surprising, skewing a little more liberal along the way. But look how we get up here when we see the Associated Press and Reuters, both which supply news but are also news services, supplying thousands of stories every day, every week to, I'm sure your own newspaper subscribes to Associated Press and uses Associated Press stories. And it's really great to me to see that probably a bulk of the stories that show up in the average American's newspaper every day are at least coming from organizations that are trying very hard to be at the top level and as partisan, nonpartisan as possible along the way. Let me throw out to you guys at this point, what do you think of this here? Does your favorite news organization, if you see it on here, does it fit in this chart where they've placed it?
Looks good. Look at the preponderance of left of center. More publications.
Yeah, a few more. Sorry, I'll get back to the big one so that we can see. One of the questions I have about the people who did this is that how did they pick the news organizations that appear here? And did they pick equal numbers, or did they just go out and select, the largest 50 news organizations? So how you do your research to put them on here makes a big difference. And I'll tell you, how you begin to rate something as being more liberal or more conservative is a very challenging question from a research perspective. And that to take and do this kind of work to place this requires a lot of numerical crunching of stories over periods of years, not to mention a very careful analysis of what that data shows you. How can you tell if a story skews liberal or conservative? It's a much harder question than you know. So I take this news chart with a grain of salt, which the question was asked earlier, but it's not a bad jumping off point. And for people who aren't so sure that they, can research easily, at least they can go to here for a baseline assessment. Who was it who asked me about this before?
I asked you about similar organizations.
Okay, and I couldn't see who that was who answered. What do you think about it?
Taken aback by the Hill being listed as skewing conservative. That doesn't strike me as in my experience, but maybe I just haven't read enough of their articles. Okay.
Yeah, and that's one of the tough parts. It's like, if I read one article from any one of these, I might place it in just one article or even five. I might place it in a completely different sector of this chart. It takes a lot of reading over time to really make an accurate assessment to place anything here along the way. This has been an interesting part this is maybe about the 8th or 10th time I've done this talk, and the first time on Zoom, by the way, so you'll have to let me know how it went here. This often gets people pretty riled up, but you guys seem to be fairly relaxed with this.
It's fine.
Anyone not?
No. You have a question?
Mark, do you know when this chart was made?
I think I pulled
17.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And obviously things can change over time. I've given one of the places where you can get the chart and you could learn more about the group that put it out. And that's one of the things I'm talking about here is that when I first got this, well, who put this together? Are these people scholars? I mean, are they journalists or just average people? And I went to go to try to find out more about them. And I'll tell you right away, I found out it's a pain in the butt. I felt like I was researching my dissertation again, and God knows I don't want to do that again. And yet I'm asking you to do, a tenth of a master's thesis every time you read the newspaper or listen to NPR. That's not fun. It's time consuming. And that's the situation we're in here with all of this, is that it's not easy sorting the wheat from the chaff. We can't use a flail like we would with real wheat to beat the stuff away. The laws forbid that. And we have a First Amendment which allows people to lie freely. Yeah. And believe it or not, that's actually a good thing for the country. The worst thing that can happen in any country is to have thought limited. And one of the things our country was founded on was not limiting thought, so that we could exchange ideas, to have what's called a free marketplace of ideas where we can all get together peacefully to discuss things. And unfortunately, the very media that was designed to get us to do that, and especially through the internet where media is much cheaper and available and more news organizations can play, we've seen a skyrocketing in news organizations, it's actually made our situation worse. So I'll take and leave this open for questions here, and because that's all I've got from this. And yeah, I'm thinking I'm at about 50, 55 minutes anyway, so I'm close to the hour. So what else do you have to ask me? Paul, please go ahead. And Susan?
One thing that I miss is old-time editorials from people like Charles Krauthammer and George Will, and I used to find them really informative, and the intelligence of what they had to say. It was well thought out. It was presented with conscience and conviction, and it used to rattle my preconceived notions about things. And I miss not having them. Well, Krauthammer is dead, but George Will just seems to surface every once in a while as a commentator, which is a shame.
I love George Will, and particularly I like to go to him because frequently, or sometimes, I had a diametrically opposed idea, but he was such a great thinker. Yeah. And he would present my perspective as he, other perspectives as he advanced his own, and would defeat them logically or sometimes not logically. But I felt good about it. But the one thing that was really cool about that period there, it was really clear that what George Will or Krauthammer was doing was opinion, was a column. And unfortunately, modern media, it's become much harder to figure out who's being a news person versus who's being a columnist, who is trying to be objective versus who has an opinion and only wants that opinion. Other questions or comments?
Mark, I have one more question. Again, thank you for doing this. It's been really, really enlightening. And I would make the argument that scientific literature has an effect on our society and well-being, and journalism has just as much of an effect on our society and well-being, and the decisions that we make as a society for how our population is going to live and thrive and exist. In the scientific literature, there are checks and balances to a certain extent. If you publish something that's fraudulent, you can lose your credibility, lose your license, you lose a lot. Is there anything similar to that in the world of journalism? And
there is.
If not, should there be? And what is it? And how can we use that to fix this system?
It's been staring us all in the face from the very start of journalism. Oh, I was reaching for my wallet and I don't have it with me. I had this great visual. It's your pocketbook. It's your attention. If you think your local newspaper is partisan and it's giving you crap news, get rid of it. Don't read it. If you don't like Fox, don't watch it. If you don't like CNN, don't watch it. And if all of America would sit down and say, you know, we're sick of this partisan crap that you're feeding us, and we're not going to use your news source anymore, the odds are really, really good that they're going to change because they want to make money. And our problem has been is that we've been willing to accept crap and not holding the news media for account. It's one thing to take and, you know, write a letter to the editor and complain about a story, or email CBS or whatever. It's another thing to hit their pocketbooks. And guess what? That is the power that we have. But unfortunately, they're going to give us the lowest level of news possible, because the lower level of news they can give us, the more money they can make. And until we say, to heck with that, give us better, they're not going to change. Now, the other thing would be too, is to say, okay, I'm going to pay for better news. And when I see an organization that's giving good news, I'm going to support them in any way I can. And, you know, I'm really hard on broadcast journalism. I don't watch television news anymore. I watch it as little as I have to for my profession, which means I'm still watching, you know, 10, 20, 30 minutes a day. I still hate it. But, you know, I don't watch them much. And I give my money to NPR because I think they're the only broadcast news in the country that's worthwhile, even though I know they skew liberal often along the way. So vote with your pocketbook.
Right, but aren't some of those organizations that you showed on that chart supported by corporations that are way more fiscally powerful than I am?
Yeah, and it's certainly the Murdochs and Fox. But you know, if their profits drop 100 million a year, they're going to think about changes. And you're right. How do you combat them if you're just one person? You can't. But certainly we can talk with one another and point out, you know, here's what Fox News said. Here's what 3 other news sources have said that show that demonstrably they were wrong and it was fake news. Please stop watching them. You know, that's really our pocketbook is really our only vote at this point. Someone else.
I don't quite know how to put this, but I wonder about not, you know, supporting a news organization at the same time as, I think, important lies. And I say important, I guess I'm talking about QAnon and what the responsibility of the media is. Do they increase the support of a group of people like QAnon, or is it the duty to teach and try to get the truth out? What role does the media have in such a thing?
It's absolutely one of the secondary, the second most important thing the news can do besides tell you what's happening today is to educate you about an issue. It's not enough to say that President Trump said X today. You have to, a good news organization will say, well, Trump said X today. Here's what we know about this, and how he is or isn't right, and how the facts are correct or not, and how this might or might not work. That's what a good news organization should be doing. And to be honest with you, a lot, if not a vast majority of news organizations are failing on educating us on these issues. They seem to be very content with just the reveal story. Today, Trump said this. It pissed off the Democrats. That doesn't help anyone. It has to be that educational story. And unfortunately, news organizations have been so hurt by the internet that they've laid off huge percentage of staff. Some news organizations, like 60% of their staff is gone. A local paper over here in New Hampshire, over towards Nashua, about 5-6 years ago, they laid off 5 photographers and hired one of them back, and now that person was doing, you know, all of that work. That's not acceptable. So we need to support the good news organizations, but it's hard. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. It has been an honor and a privilege. I really appreciated the questions that came this way and your patience with this, and with accepting the idea that unfortunately, we've got a lot of work to do. And as I forget who it was who just asked me, forgive me, I lost your name. You had a great thought there about educating others. We need to teach our friends, we need to teach our children, and we need media literacy classes in junior high school and high school to help people start to be able to do this themselves. And unfortunately, that's going to be a problem, because I've seen programs like this go into school about how to think critically about things. And oh my God, it only takes about a month before parents are up in arms and trying to fire the teacher and to kick the class out. Because when we teach people to think critically, and I don't just mean to think about criticizing, but to actually do and ask the right questions, it just pisses people off. Excuse my French, but that's exactly what happens. And that's what we're seeing here with the partisanship and the our seeming inability as a country to talk with one another anymore.
I happen to be a middle school teacher, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, both my parents were high school teachers. So yeah, I've seen this situation, and I've covered school board meetings as a reporter. And you'll never see a dumber group of people in your life than at a school board meeting. I hate to say it. Or the only worst place is to go to a marina boat ramp and watch people putting in their boats. That's even dumber groups of people. Sorry to be so terrible on that, but honest to God, I've had the biggest chuckles in my life at both of those places. Anyway, I'll turn this back over to you folks and let you have the rest of your evening off. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. Much food for thought.
Thank you.
Mark, sorry, do you have time for one more question?
Go ahead.
A lot of your talk had to do with journalists that we're all aware of, some credible, some not so credible. But nowadays, it seems like a lot of people are getting the information from social media feeds, and they're actually getting information from places that are not news sources. They're actually just clickbait things put out there that are not from journalists, be it good or bad, at their job. Do you think that journalism in itself is at risk of sort of being pushed out by this extremely artificial news information that comes across social media feeds? And I don't know, is there a solution for kind of saving good journalism?
Boy, if I could answer that second question, Tim, I'd be a billionaire inside of 10 years. Because this is the question that news organizations are asking themselves and have been for the last decade, and they can't come up with a good answer at all. Yes, news organizations are being pushed out because we've already seen how many have closed. I forget how many newspapers have closed within the last 10 years. I think it's like a couple hundred. Certainly, we're seeing news staffs laid off. It's been a problem for our students newly graduated. It's harder to get work because there just aren't as many positions. And for every position, there's 20 veteran journalists they're running against. So that's an issue. But I'm a little bit optimistic in that sooner or later, people are going to learn that you can't just trust anything that comes along, that there's a reason why we go to NPR or whatever news source we go to. By the way, if you want international news, I love the BBC. That's my place to go, especially for national news about the United States. It gets rid of the perspective from an American viewpoint. So there's places to go to there, and there's always going to be a few news organizations that do excel because people recognize good stuff versus crap. I might have sounded pessimistic as hell, but I am still, but I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not always a train.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions again, since I'm still here? Okay, I'll hang back up again and I'll jump off the line here. Again, thank you folks. I appreciated it. I hope you all survive the winter and the third phase of the pandemic here well, and that you can separate the good news from the bad and the fake more easily after tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
That was great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.